The mailbox lid was already open when I reached it, though I hadn't touched it. Inside, there was nothing but a loose rubber band and a grocery flyer addressed to someone else. My bank statement, always folded once, always placed on top, was gone. From the porch, my son waved and said, "I sorted the junk for you." He smiled. The slot stayed empty. When I moved into the smaller place near my son, it was framed as a sensible adjustment. Practical. Temporary, even. The boxes were stacked neatly by the door the first morning, each one labeled in his handwriting. Kitchen. Clothes. Papers. I placed my mug on the counter I'd wiped the night before, careful not to leave rings. The window over the sink faced a narrow strip of grass where sparrows gathered. I watched them while the toast browned. The radio stayed low. I preferred the hum of the refrigerator and the distant traffic. Quiet has weight when you're older. It presses gently, steadily. My son stopped by most afternoons. Sometimes he brought groceries and stacked them where he thought they belonged. Sometimes he adjusted things, moved a chair closer to the window, straightened a stack of envelopes I kept by the door. He set my pills into a weekly organizer I hadn't asked for. "It'll make things simpler," he said, snapping the lids shut. I watched his hands, efficient and confident, and told myself this was what help looked like. There were small changes that felt reasonable at first. He suggested automatic payments so I wouldn't have to worry. He offered to call the cable company because the menus were confusing. He left notes on the counter reminding me to lock the door, to drink water, to turn off the stove. I read them, folded them once, and tucked them into a drawer. The drawer began to fill. The apartment developed its own sounds. The tick of the wall clock I'd brought from my old house. The elevator bell down the hall, footsteps passing, then fading. I learned which noises belonged to me and which did not. On Tuesdays, the mail cart rattled down the hallway mid-morning. I liked the brief ceremony of it, the soft thud as envelopes hit the mat, the smell of paper warmed by travel. It anchored the day. Some mornings there was less on the mat, a flyer or two, a catalog I didn't remember ordering. I assumed delays, weather, a mistake. My son was already inside sometimes, leaning against the counter with his phone, asking if I needed anything. He took the trash out without being asked. He checked the thermostat and turned it down a notch. I wrapped my sweater tighter and said nothing. I noticed how often he placed himself between me and small decisions. He answered questions directed at me when the maintenance man came. He carried my wallet into the bedroom after setting it on the dresser, saying it was safer there. He suggested I keep my checkbook in one place so it doesn't get lost, and placed it in a drawer I rarely opened. The days were orderly. My calendar remained mostly blank, except for his visits penciled in neatly. The envelopes by the door never grew into a pile. The apartment stayed clean. My hands were idle more than they used to be, resting in my lap as I watched the afternoon light move across the floor. When I reached for small tasks, he was already there, smiling, telling me I could relax. At night, I lay in bed listening to the building settle. Pipes clicked. Somewhere, a door closed softly. I counted breaths until sleep came. The sense of being looked after followed me into the dark, heavy, and close, like a blanket pulled a little too high. It didn't happen in a single moment. That made it harder to name. Things didn't disappear outright. They thinned. Notices arrived later than expected, or not at all. The small stack on the hall table stayed shallow no matter how many days passed. When I mentioned it, my son shrugged and said the building's mail service was unreliable. He said he'd keep an eye on it. One afternoon, I asked about a utility bill I hadn't seen. He leaned against the counter and said it was already taken care of. Paid. Switched to auto-pay. I thanked him. He waved it off and asked what I wanted for dinner. His voice was easy. His eyes moved on. A few days later, the pharmacy called while he was there. I heard my name through the speaker, then a pause. My son reached out and took the phone from my hand without asking. "Yes," he said. "She's here." Another pause. "That's fine. We already updated it." He handed the phone back and told me the refill was delayed. Supply issue. Nothing to worry about. Small substitutions followed. Channels I watched disappeared from the television and were replaced with ones I didn't recognize. The banking app on my phone logged me out and refused my password. My son said updates did that sometimes. He said he'd fix it later. later stretched into days. I began to write things down. Not accusations, just dates. What I expected, what didn't arrive, what I was told instead, a grocery receipt I couldn't find, a voicemail referring to a letter I hadn't seen. I folded the paper and kept it in my pocket. It felt steadier there. When I asked about a statement I was waiting for, my son smiled and said, "I already sorted that." He said it the way people talk about clearing clutter. Finished. Settled. He didn't offer to show me. He didn't seem to think I'd want to see it. One morning, an envelope arrived, thin, slightly bent, my name printed a little crooked. Inside was a notice about a service interruption scheduled for the following week. I showed it to him when he came by. He frowned, surprised. "That shouldn't be happening," he said. "I handled that." He folded the notice and slid it into his jacket pocket. "I'll call them." Later, after he left, I noticed his jacket draped over the chair. The notice was no longer inside. I called a customer service number from an old bill I found tucked into a cookbook. The automated system asked for verification I no longer had. When I reached a person, she used my son's name while explaining the account status. I corrected her. She apologized and said that's what the system showed. He was listed as the primary contact. That evening, my son arrived with a folder. He placed it on the table between us and opened it. Inside were summaries, not originals, totals without detail. He pointed as he spoke, explaining decisions already made. I listened. I asked where the letters were. He said they were confusing and unnecessary. "This is simpler," he said. The next day, a neighbor mentioned a delivery I'd missed. A courier had come while I was home and left after no one answered. I checked with the front desk. They had a signature authorizing redirection. It wasn't mine. I found the torn envelope later in the recycling bin. My name was still visible through the rip. The contents were gone. When I asked my son about it, he didn't deny it. He said he was protecting me from stress. He said too much information wasn't good for me. He said he was doing what anyone would do. His voice stayed even. His hands were steady. That evening, another call came. Another service. Another change already made. Another explanation offered before I could ask. I sat at the small table, the folded paper in my pocket heavier now. The apartment felt tighter, as if the walls had edged closer. By the end of the week, my name was still on the door, but fewer things seemed to belong to me. Access required permission. Answers arrived filtered. Decisions happened elsewhere and were delivered afterward. I folded the latest notice and added it to the others, feeling the edge where paper meets paper. Whatever this was, it had moved beyond help. The days began to blur, not because they were empty, but because they no longer belonged to me. Morning light still slid through the blinds. The hum of traffic continued. The elevator bell rang at regular intervals. But my place inside those rhythms felt uncertain, as if I were slightly out of alignment with my own life. I waited more than I ever had before. Waiting for my son to arrive. Waiting for answers I no longer asked out loud. Waiting for the phone to ring, and half hoping it wouldn't. When it did, I listened carefully, aware the call might not be meant for me. I noticed the pauses before people spoke, the way my name was used and then gently set aside. I began holding the receiver tighter, as if that alone might keep me present in the conversation. Objects around me shifted in meaning. The small table by the door where I used to drop my keys stayed bare. My purse remained on the bedroom chair where it had been moved and left. I opened drawers and found everything arranged neatly, precisely, but according to a logic that wasn't mine. The order was clean, efficient, impersonal. I hesitated before doing ordinary things. Turning on the television, opening my laptop, dialing a number. There was a pause now between intention and action, a moment where I wondered whether I still had the right. That hesitation settled in quietly and refused to leave. The small confirmations that once reassured me I existed in the world stopped arriving. No receipts, no follow-up letters, no notices addressed to me alone. When I spoke, people were polite, but their answers drifted elsewhere. "That's already been handled," they said, or "We have instructions on file." Instructions I hadn't given. The apartment itself stayed calm. Too calm. My son's visits were efficient, purposeful. He checked things off lists I couldn't see. He spoke in summaries. He asked if I was comfortable. I said yes, because discomfort is hard to name when it doesn't announce itself. It doesn't hurt sharply. It erodes. Meals tasted thin, not because the food was different, but because I ate without appetite. I sat at the table and noticed how often my hands rested in my lap. I had always been someone who reached toward a task, a pen, a decision. Now I watched instead. Observation replaced action. At night, I listened to the building settle. Pipes clicked behind the walls. Somewhere, a door closed softly. I replayed conversations in my head, not to argue with them, but to confirm they had happened. Memory became something I checked against itself. I wondered whether the gaps were real or imagined. Doubt arrived not as panic, but as fog. I thought about how easily a person could be reduced without being pushed. No raised voices, no slammed doors, just small adjustments made on their behalf. A form filled out, a box checked, a decision rerouted. The result was the same: absence. I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror one afternoon. I looked composed, clean, properly cared for. That image didn't match how I felt. I felt like a guest in my own life, allowed to stay as long as I didn't rearrange anything or ask questions. The folded list in my pocket grew longer. I didn't read it often. I didn't need to. I could feel its weight when I walked. Each line represented something I could no longer access without permission. Each line confirmed that what was being taken wasn't dramatic enough to alarm anyone else, but it was loud inside me. I spoke less. Not because there was nothing to say, but because I was tired of hearing my words redirected. Silence became a way to preserve what little remained untouched. In silence, at least, my thoughts were still mine. One evening, I sat by the window and watched lights come on in other apartments. People moved through their routines. Doors opened. Doors closed. I wondered how many of them knew exactly where their mail was, who could speak for them, which decisions were being made in their name. I stayed there until the room darkened. The quiet settled again, familiar now. Not peaceful, just settled. Whatever this was doing to me, it wasn't finished. It had already changed the shape of my days, and I could feel something important thinning, like paper worn too many times along the same fold. I didn't stop him. That was the decision I made, though it didn't feel like one at first. I let the days proceed as they were. I accepted the explanations when they came. I nodded at the summaries. I thanked him for checking things off. From the outside, nothing shifted. Inside, I began to slow everything down. I returned to habits I hadn't used in years. I wrote by hand. Not arguments. Not complaints. Facts. Dates. What arrived. What didn't. The order in which things happened. I used a small notebook from the nightstand, the kind with thick paper and a cloth spine. I wrote with a pencil so nothing bled through. When a page filled, I tore it out carefully and folded it into quarters. Paper carries quietly. I paid closer attention to the apartment itself, the rhythm of footsteps in the hall, the timing of the mail cart, which neighbors checked their boxes early and which waited until evening. I learned when the front desk was busiest and when it wasn't. I noticed which notices were posted publicly and which were slipped under doors. I stopped asking questions that invited explanations. Instead, I listened. When my son spoke on the phone in the kitchen, I stayed in the living room and let the words drift. Names. Phrases. The way he referred to me, briefly, efficiently, like a line item. I didn't interrupt. I gathered what I already had. Old statements tucked into books. Cards with numbers written on the back. Receipts folded inside envelopes that had been reused. I didn't move them all at once. One or two at a time, placed together in a folder I kept beneath the bed. It was heavy enough to feel real when I slid it out, thin enough to hide again easily. I adjusted my routines to test the edges without touching them. I took the stairs instead of the elevator some mornings. I walked a longer loop around the block. I visited the lobby at different hours. I watched how information moved when I didn't ask for it. When my son suggested another convenience, I agreed. I let the pattern continue. There was value in consistency. It kept expectations stable. It kept him relaxed. People are less careful when they believe they're in control. At night, I rehearsed nothing. I didn't imagine speeches or outcomes. I focused on what I could still do without permission. I could observe. I could document. I could choose when to speak and when not to. Those were not small things. It returned certain objects to where they had been before, quietly. My keys went back to the table by the door. My wallet returned to my pocket. When they were moved again, I noted it and said nothing. Noticing became its own anchor. I practiced saying less with intention. Short answers, neutral responses, no corrections, no challenges. Silence can look like agreement to someone who wants it to. It can also be space to prepare. The notebook filled. The folder thickened. My handwriting steadied as the days passed. I slept better, not because anything improved, but because I had stopped being pulled along by it. I was moving at my own pace again, even if no one else could see it. One afternoon, my son stood at the counter explaining another adjustment he'd made. I watched his hands as he spoke. Confident. Practiced. He finished and looked up, waiting. I smiled and said, "All right." His shoulders eased. That was when I understood the value of letting things unfold a little longer, not out of fear, out of clarity. I wasn't ready to act yet, but I was ready to be precise. When I closed the notebook that evening and slid it back into place, I did it slowly, deliberately. Nothing had been corrected, nothing resolved, but the ground beneath me felt firmer than it had in weeks. I wasn't taking anything back yet. I was making sure I knew exactly what needed to be reclaimed. I chose a morning when the building was quiet, midweek, late enough that offices were open, early enough that habits hadn't fully settled. I dressed simply and carried only what I needed. The folder went into my bag. The notebook stayed behind. I didn't want anything that looked like emotion. I wanted records. At the front desk, I asked for a private room. I gave my name slowly and clearly. The clerk checked the system and hesitated. I watched the pause, the brief flicker in her eyes as she looked from the screen back to me. She said there were notes attached to my account. I asked to see them. She said she couldn't, but she could bring a supervisor. I waited. The supervisor arrived with a tablet. I asked for a summary of all access changes connected to my residence, utilities, and deliveries. I asked for dates, for authorizations, for copies sent to my address, the one on the door. She scrolled, nodded, and said some changes had been made remotely. She said a secondary contact had been promoted to primary. She said redirection had been authorized. I asked whose signature was on file. She turned the tablet toward me. It wasn't mine. I didn't raise my voice. I asked what the procedure was to restore original access. She explained it step by step. Verification, identity confirmation, written request, timestamps. I followed each step. I signed where required. I provided identification. I asked for confirmation numbers and wrote them down carefully. Next, I went to the building's mail services office. I asked for delivery logs. They showed me dates, holds, redirections marked authorized. I asked to see the authorization. They printed it. It matched what I'd already seen. Same name. Same signature. Not mine. I requested immediate reversal. They complied. I asked that future deliveries require in-person verification. They agreed. The phone rang. I answered. A service representative confirmed the restoration. Then another. Then another. Each call ended with a reference number. Each number went onto a single page. My handwriting stayed even. In the afternoon, the door opened and my son came in. He stopped when he saw the papers on the table. He asked what was going on. I told him access had been restored. I told him redirections had been reversed. I told him my name was back where it belonged. I didn't accuse. I didn't explain. I didn't need to. He said he was trying to help. He said it was easier this way. He said the systems were confusing. I asked him to sit. I slid the printed authorizations across the table and asked him to look at the signatures. He looked. He didn't speak. I told him the conditions. They were simple. My mail would remain unopened unless I asked. My accounts would remain in my name. Any changes would be discussed before they happened, not after. I told him I had documented everything. I told him the documentation would stay current. He said he hadn't realized it had gone that far. I told him it had gone exactly as far as it had been allowed to go. I asked for my keys. He handed them over. I asked for my wallet. He retrieved it from the bedroom and placed it on the table. That evening, the mail arrived. The cart rattled down the hall. Envelopes landed on the mat. I picked them up myself. They were addressed to me. All of them. Over the next few days, confirmations arrived. Statements, notices, originals. The folder grew thinner as it finished its work and was no longer needed. The apartment felt larger. Not because anything had changed physically, but because I moved through it without hesitation. My son came less often. When he did, he asked before touching things. He waited for answers instead of supplying them. The shift was subtle but complete. Control doesn't always resist when it's removed. Sometimes it simply stops. I updated my preferences everywhere they mattered. I set alerts. I required confirmation for changes. I restored old routines. The table by the door held my keys again. The drawer with my papers was mine to open and close. One afternoon, I stood by the window and watched the mail cart arrive. I waited until it passed my door. Then I opened it and collected what belonged to me. The paper felt warm from travel. Solid, ordinary. Nothing dramatic followed. No voices echoed down the hall. No doors slammed. What happened was quieter and more lasting. Systems recognized me again. Records matched reality. The world resumed addressing me directly. That was enough. I think about that first morning often. The open mailbox, the space where something familiar should have been. At the time, it felt small enough to dismiss. A minor disruption, something easily explained. But it carried weight long before I had words for it. Not fear. Not anger. Unease. The quiet awareness that something personal had been handled without me. What I see more clearly now is that the harm wasn't contained in any single act. It lived in the accumulation. In how choice can be narrowed until it becomes suggestion. In how identity can be softened into convenience. I didn't lose myself in one moment. I was eased aside gradually, until I wasn't certain where my place was anymore. I don't believe my son set out to erase me. Control rarely announces itself that way. It arrives dressed as concern. It sounds reasonable. It promises relief. That is what makes it persuasive. When help moves faster than consent, it doesn't feel like harm at first. It feels efficient. And by the time you sense the cost, the language to object has already been replaced. Reclaiming my place didn't undo everything. It didn't erase the weeks of doubt or the hesitation that crept into my hands. What it gave me was steadiness, clarity. An understanding that dignity isn't loud. It doesn't demand attention or prove itself. It lives in small permissions we grant ourselves. The right to open our own mail. The right to ask questions and receive answers without translation. I move differently now. Not guarded. Intentional. I pay attention to where my things rest. I keep my routines intact. I speak sooner, with fewer words. Silence still has value, but it no longer carries my consent by default. The apartment hasn't changed. The table by the door, the window over the sink, the clock on the wall. But I occupy the space fully again. When the mail arrives, I hear it. When the phone rings, it's meant for me. These are ordinary things, but they root me in ways I didn't recognize before. If there is wisdom here, it isn't about blame or triumph. It's about recognition. About noticing when care begins to cost you your voice. About understanding that needing help does not cancel your right to be present in your own life. I don't feel victorious. I feel settled. The kind of calm that comes from alignment, not relief. The kind that doesn't need an audience. What was crossed that first morning couldn't be undone, but it didn't have to define what followed. I found my way back to myself quietly, without spectacle. And I've learned that this is often how the most lasting corrections are made. If this story stayed with you, take a moment before moving on. Situations like this don't always come with raised voices or clear villains. Often they arrive quietly, wrapped in concern, and that's what makes them hard to name. If you've ever felt your independence shrink under the cover of help, or if you've had to reclaim your place with patience and care, you're not alone. You're welcome to share your thoughts or experiences here. These reflections matter, and sometimes naming them is how dignity is protected.